On behalf of the public engagement team of Belfast South Methodist Church at the Agape Centre, we'd like to welcome you to the first of two evenings on the theme of Towards the Elimination of Poverty. Our second evening will be on April the 21st, but more about that later. My name is Helen McHugh, and I'm a member of the congregation of Belfast South. We're very thankful that due to modern technology, we're able to have many of you joining us from much farther afield than would have been possible with our face-to-face meetings. So a particular welcome to those who are joining us from England, Scotland. Not sure if we've anybody from the south of Ireland, and I'm sure other places.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do.
I think we have with us Ms. Shirley Grieve, representing the moderator of the Church of Scotland, and also the Reverend Dr. Tom McKnight, the President of the Methodist Church in Ireland. And we're also pleased to have representatives of community organisations with us as well. Thank you to everyone who has helped to publicise these two events, especially the Retreat and Conference Centre at Dramalis in Larne and the South Belfast Quakers. We hope that during the two evenings we will be able to understand better the roots of poverty, but more importantly to look at what can be done and also how our politicians can be involved in helping to improve the situation. I'd like to introduce two key people for this evening's conference. First of all, Paul Morrison, who is Policy Advisor with the Joint Public Issues team, made up of the Baptist Union, the Church of Scotland, the Methodist Church and the United Reformed Church in Britain. And Paul has particular responsibility for issues around the economy, including poverty and inequality. And Paul is joining us for the first time, and we're very grateful to him for all his help. So very warm welcome to you, Paul. The second person is not joining us for the first time, and it's the Reverend Dr. Johnson McMaster. Johnson, if anybody doesn't know him, is a theologian, a historian, Methodist minister, an international speaker, the author of 11 books and the co-author of several more. And that's just to mention a few things. But Johnson has been a very good friend to all of us in Belfast South and especially to our public engagement team. And he has kindly agreed to moderate both this evening and our second meeting on the 21st of April. So Johnson, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Helen, thank you for a very generous welcome. Delighted to be able to moderate or facilitate the discussion over these two evenings, and great that we've such a diverse group of people gathered, and that should make for a very enriching conversation when it comes to the smaller discussion groups and when we come to the plenary session later on. Just a quick run through the order, the running order, if you like, for this evening before we ask Paul to make his presentation. We have this beginning, and then Paul will make his presentation until about 8:10, 8:10. And then we will be allocated to smaller groups, rooms as they're known in Zoom language. And in those smaller groups, we have an opportunity to share together, have conversation together, and explore some of the issues that have been raised. At about 8:30, we'll come back into plenary. And from then until about 5 to 9, it will be an open shared discussion and conversation, continuing the exploration of issues that Paul has raised. And about 5 to 9, 8:55, we'll begin to wind down and plan to go off air at 9 o'clock. Paul, great to have you present this evening, and over to you.
Right, avoided the first mistake, which is to do the first 3 slides with the mute on, which has been all too common over the past few months. Would it be helpful if I just shared my screen and went through slides, or would you rather have the sort of the larger group that you can see, and I'll just show the slides that are important? So those who think that they'd like to see everyone's faces, if you wiggle your heads or wave now, you're getting the slides then. So I'm just going to do share screen now, and hopefully that will work. And I think it's really great to be here, if only so that I hear people speaking properly, which happens so rarely where I am in London now. And I'm really pleased to be able to talk about this. Helen's already talked about who the Joint Public Issues team and the sort of there's a breadth of things we cover which aren't just around poverty and inequality. There's things around gambling, peace, climate change is becoming clearly more and more important. But I'll just move on. And one of the things that is fired at you as soon as you talk about, say, towards the elimination of poverty, is people go, but didn't Jesus say the poor will always be with us? So I figured I'd start there because the message of that statement's rather different from what you might think. So it appears in 3 Gospels. It appears in Matthew and in Mark and in John. And in the first Gospel, in the first 2 Gospels, it's a disciple or it's somebody nearby to Jesus asks a question. And they ask the question, which is essentially, a woman has come to Jesus and is anointing him with really expensive oil. And somebody says, wouldn't it be better if we just sold that oil and gave it to the poor? And they're trying really hard to make the person feel bad. It's meant to be a difficult question. And if you want an idea as to what the gospel writers thought about that question, is when you get to John, the person who asks that question is Judas. If it's put in Judas's mouth, it's probably not a good thing by the time it gets to John. Because the response that Jesus gives, the poor will always be with us, is calling back to another part of the gospel, or another part of the Bible, which is in Deuteronomy and Deuteronomy 15. But in that section of Deuteronomy, there are rules about how you run your society. That's the place where you find rules about Jubilee, where debt is essentially cancelled once every generation. It's where you find rules about how you treat people who are indebted to you, and about how slaves must be freed. These are rules about economic justice. And Jesus is calling back to say, this is a question, if you want to get rid of poverty, it's actually a question of justice. It's a question about how you run your society. It's not about one act of charity. And I thought I'd show you this picture. And this is of the first ever Methodist building. It's called the Foundry. It was called the Foundry because it was actually an abandoned cannon factory that the Methodists squatted in for a little bit of time before they eventually bought it. But in the Foundry, there was a worship space, as you would expect, but very quickly it was in a very impoverished part of East London, and very quickly it becomes what we would see today as a food bank, and it becomes what we might see, and it gives out food, it gives out clothes, it gives out loans, even small business loans so people can buy tools for their jobs. It does all sorts of things to try alleviate poverty. But very quickly, within 10 years of it starting, what happens is that they recognize there are some structures in society which were causing the poverty they were seeing. And so this is an old print, and I'm pointing at it like you can see it. It's over there on my screen, and that's why. So it's over here, and it's an old print and underneath it says, "Here's a guinea, get your husband from prison." Because the issue there was that when you got into debt at that time, you were sent to prison. And in order to get out of prison, not only did you have to pay your debt, you also had to pay your room and board for when you were in prison. So they found that lots of women were turning to prostitution, were turning to crime, were turning to the church to try scrape together enough money to get the breadwinner of the family out of prison. And one of the first things that the Methodist Church did was campaign to change the rules so that people didn't have to pay their room and board in prison, so that these women didn't come to the church in poverty and come to the church needing help. And this idea that to alleviate poverty, it's more than just being a food bank, giving something out, but you have to change giving out food or giving out clothes or even giving out money. It's also about understanding the society in which we operate and trying to change those structures such that poverty is less common. And I thought for the first part of what I'm going to say, it's about what does poverty in the UK look like today? And the reason I think it's important to say that is what I've found talking to churches sort of around the United Kingdom has been that at the point you came sort of came of age, what poverty looked like then is what your vision of poverty is today. So if you came of age in the 1980s, it's about mass unemployment. If you came of age a bit before that, it's about other stuff. It's about other things. So it's really important to focus on what poverty looks like today and deal with today's problem, because lots of people want to deal with a problem that is different, that has changed and moved on. And one of the first things I want to do, and I'll just check that it's sharing sound, it is play this short video. It's only about 1.5 minutes. And one of the things that happens when we talk about poverty is we often don't include the voices of those who actually experience poverty. So this is someone telling her own story she was from talking to people in a church in Glasgow where they run a Poverty Truth Commission. But the story is, well, it's quite typical.
Hi, my name is Hazel. I'm a single mum from Fife. My sons are 17 and 15. I have been on my own with them since their dad walked out when they were young. Since then, I've either struggled on benefits or I've been working, but with just one income, it's never been enough. I have worked full-time for a good decent wage, and then I have worked part-time for minimum wage, and there's never been much difference. When working full-time, I didn't get tax credits or housing benefit, and I was living on my wage alone. Then working part-time, with a little top-up of tax credits and housing benefit, it still left me with no more than previously. For me to get a better wage and a decent quality of life, I would really need to be earning a much higher wage. If I compare things to an object, it would be a hamster's wheel. No matter how hard I work and how much I push myself, I still feel I'm getting nowhere. I feel like it's a never-ending journey with no end. It feels like I am working and pushing myself so hard, but I'm just going round in circles and going nowhere.
And that's not the most dramatic story of poverty. And it's not the one that will get into a newspaper headline. But it's a true story of poverty because it is long and it is grinding. poverty isn't about a moment. Poverty is about tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and constantly being worried about what happens next. So Hazel would be counted as living in poverty for part of that time and would probably be above the poverty threshold, or what we count as numbers for some other parts of that time. So I'm just going to give you some numbers, but if you can imagine, if you have Hazel in your head, or maybe someone else who you know, she's teetering on the brink. So within the United Kingdom as a whole, there's about 14.4 million people experienced poverty last year. And this is pre-pandemic. These numbers go up to April last year. So maybe there's a month of the pandemic in there. And that's about 400,000 people in Northern Ireland experience poverty. And the rates are about the same. And this is using a measure, this is using quite a complicated measure from the Social Metrics Commission. I've changed to using that measure, not because it's much better, but because it's the one that essentially those who support the Conservative Party use. So it's essentially the one that they will not criticize and say maybe isn't right, or it's not real poverty. So I've taken to using that because they're all the numbers come out very much the same. One of the other things to say is that translates to about 4.5 million children in the UK experiencing poverty, and that's 33%. In Northern Ireland, it's around 100,000 and about 29%. The difference between poverty and children's poverty in Northern Ireland and with the rest of the UK is actually to do with there being more social housing in Northern Ireland. Having social housing is quite protective against poverty, especially if you've got a family, and there's more of it in Northern Ireland than there is in the rest of the UK. So that's why there's that small difference there. But one of the things that's really important to say is you'll notice that 33 is bigger than 21 or 22, because we focus poverty on the poor, on the youngest. So this is a graph of this side of from 0 to 4-year-olds all the way to 75-year-olds, and it's just around age. And the older you get, the less likely you are to live in poverty. It wasn't always the case. Back in 1992, the group most likely to experience poverty were actually pensioners. It was up at 38% at that point in time, but we decided that wasn't right, and we changed some policies, and various other things happened. And now the least likely group to experience poverty in the UK are pensioners. And that's just another way of saying it. If you look at who experiences poverty, these are slightly older figures, because you can't do this. You need to use the 3-year spread to get these numbers correctly. But it's working age adults and children and pensioners, about 1.3 million pensioners experiencing poverty. But probably the thing that you will find most surprising, or maybe not, but the thing that goes against the narrative at the moment is this: that the majority of people who live in poverty are in working families. So the different shades of blue that's two parents, both working full time. And even then, 3.3 million are experiencing poverty. That's working either one full-time job to 1.5 full-time jobs, depending. And that's at least one person working part-time. So even working full-time, 2 parents in a family, poverty still happens. And when you see this group, who are often called workless, and when politicians say workless, what it conjures up in your mind is unemployment. Unemployment in the UK has since the mid-2000s been really transient for most people. It lasts on average about 12 weeks before people move into another job. What happens is people move from one job to another job to another job. So it's called the low pay, no pay cycle of you do short-term insecure work to short-term insecure work. But actually the biggest group of that 4 million, that's actually only a small slice of that 4 million. The biggest group there will be people who are either unable to work through illness or unable to work through caring responsibilities. So if you're ill or you're disabled, your rates of poverty are much, much higher. And then there's about 1 million people who have retired. So they're not claiming disability benefits, but they're not working. So they're at the end of their working life. And it is probably health issues, but the numbers don't tell us that. But one of the really important things to know is the past 10 years has seen increasing levels of employment, both decreasing unemployment, but also increasing employment, which means that more people in more families are looking for work. So when you had a 2-parent family, sometimes you'd have chosen to have one part-time, one full-time. We've also got more going both full-time, or more going one, and moving up that engagement in the labour market spectrum. But even with more jobs, less unemployment, more engagement with the labour market, child poverty rates continue to increase. And so the idea that work is going to stop poverty is just not true. It's been tested. The experiment has been done, and it's been found it's been found wanting. And this is quite a complicated graph to show on a screen like this. But the important thing that comes from the graph is, I keep pointing at the screen with my hand, and that's no use to man nor beast, so I'm sorry. What we have here is 3 lines. These are the poorest families. And down here we have the year. So we start in 1961. The numbers run out in 2018. And this is the weekly family income for the poorest families, for the median families, and for the richest families. And you see that from about the mid-90s, really there hasn't been much growth. And what growth there hasn't been because families' wages have gone up. It's because there's been more work going on in families. The average wage stayed about the same. They just did more work. For median, much of that growth has actually been families doing more work. But for the richest, this is the 90th centile, but for about the richest quarter of society, wages kept growing and kept growing a lot. And really that took off around 1979, 1980. And that we see this divergence. And the story of poverty over the past 30 years has been that you have this divergence between rich and poor, which actually in income terms has slowed down for this decade. So it went up and then it stopped. But what replaced it was something that's talked about a bit less, which is something called wealth inequality. So that's the amount of money and goods and assets that a family has. And that has been increasing for the richest. And we've only got data back to 2010 that is comparable. It was only started being measured in 2008. But if you look at other measures, you can see it follows the same trajectory, that wealth is slowly accumulating in richer families. In median families, it's staying flat. And in poorer families, it's gone down. And it continues to go down. And by wealth, largely that increase is in terms of things like pension plans and in things like in housing and pension plans and things like that. And one of the things that's really important about this increase in wealth is that it's getting to be on a par for, if you look at the amount of money coming into families, the increase in wealth of the top 10% is by and large about the same as their income. So they don't feel it because you don't feel your house getting more expensive, and you don't feel your pension plan growing. But actually, in terms of them, in terms of that group getting more, it's happening in this kind of quiet and untaxed way. And just as importantly, that isn't an accumulation of wealth through I've earned this money and I'm going to save it and squirrel it away. Resolution Foundation just did some research, and between 80 and 90% of it, depending on the year, is actually what they call passive wealth accumulation or unearned wealth accumulation. It's that things you owned got more expensive. You didn't do anything for it, but the things you had got more expensive. And if you own them, that's good for you. You get part of that growth. But if you don't own things, if you don't have wealth, well, you're excluded from that growth. So we see this changing income inequality, which is coupled with a wealth inequality, which means that money concentrates itself towards the top of society and continues to do so. And there's a question that's important if we're to think about how we tackle poverty, which is why did that rise and why did that trajectory come about? And I'm going to go back to a graph, don't worry about it, it's just mainly remind me. And this is income inequality. And it's really clear that you can see that around about this point, around about the start of the 80s, the way the economy worked was fundamentally rewired. And actually, if you look at all sorts of economic data, you know, sort of numbers you might like, as well as numbers you might not like, you can see that as a turning point. And I don't really propose to go into, I know it was a time of huge conflict in, actually huge conflict in Northern Ireland for some reasons, but also huge social conflict across the United Kingdom. And it was deeply controversial, the changes that happened there. I can just about remember that time myself, and it was mainly, my main concern was why girls didn't like me. And I eventually left for England to see if any of them would like me, because these Northern Irish girls definitely didn't, was what I've discovered. But it left a mark, and it's important to understand what that mark is and what those rules are, for good or ill. And one of the key characteristics, and there's a number I could talk about, but there's limited time, and I think there's sort of limited brain space as well. But one of the key characteristics was it prioritized owning things. And that needs unpacked a little. So it prioritized owning things. So for instance, if you owned a company, that company affects workers, it affects the community that's around it, it has all sorts of people who are affected by its actions. But what happened in the 1980s was a philosophy came along which said it should operate only in the interests of its owners. And so the rights of workers and the rights of others around them became more subsidiary. So you can see that in labor market law. So you can see that in, you know, you can outsource your cleaning staff. And for the owners, that makes a lot of sense. You can do it cheaper. But for the cleaning staff, it may make less sense because they get a less secure job, possibly on worse terms and conditions, and certainly worse long term. But also, in another sort of less obvious way than that, is there's a principle which is that you were to maximize shareholder value. That was the purpose of a company. And it was written into company law that the management of the company's sole duty was to maximize shareholder value. Now, they could take quite a broad view of that, and it didn't have to mean you had to maximize their value tomorrow. You could take a long-term view, or you could take a short-term view, but that's what you were there to do. You were there to serve your shareholders, not your staff, and not even really your customers. You served your customers as a means to maximizing the value for your shareholders, which means if you're a shareholder, that's good news. And if you have a pension plan, you're a shareholder in sort of by second or third hand. But if you aren't a shareholder, and if you work in one of those companies, or if you are a supplier to one of those companies, then it's much less good news for you. And there's other things. There becomes an idea that regulation is bad. Now, regulation, essentially, I own something, and what regulations do is they tell me I can't do what I want with it. So, for instance, I own a large lump of coal. Regulation means I can't burn it in Belfast anymore because it's a smokeless zone. And if I burn coal in Belfast, smoke goes up the chimney, that affects everyone else, and the society has said, I'm regulating that out of existence because it's bad for people. But regulations, if you think regulations are by and large bad, what you're actually saying is, I think the owners should have more control. I think they should be less inhibited. And that's all of that seems okay, and you can see that there's trade-offs and balances. And when Aquinas comes along and says and justifies property for Christians, what he says is private property is all right, in as much as because you own something, you have an interest in it and you'll look after it, and and things that aren't owned and are shared might be let to rot. So having an interest in something's a good thing. But he also puts two codicils in, one which is really harsh, which becomes a bit more relevant later on in the story, which is essentially, if you have a surplus of private property and the person next to you is starving, then you should give it to him. And if you don't give it to him, he's got the right to steal it from you, covertly and in the dead of night if needs be, because that's not fair, that's not right. But he also says that private property should be held and used for the common good. And so there's this codicil that says it's all right to use things in your own interest, but it also has to be for the common good. And actually, these changes to the way the economy worked were justified on the same lines. They were justified around the common good. They were said that if we allow people who own things to maximize the amount of wealth they can create out of them, society will get richer, and then this wealth will trickle down. And so it was, the common good will be helped by doing this because we will all get money and it will eventually flow down. And the most common criticism is that the money doesn't flow down. And that's true. So the two most common, so, you know, we're not the first to recognize that money didn't flow down, and there's been two strategies used, and they coexist. One was emphasized by Labour, one was emphasized by the Conservatives, but they're basically the same. But they both hold both ideas. And the first one was, well, we have this economic machine and we've optimized it and it creates wealth. We'll let that run, but we'll take some money off the top and we'll pass it down through tax credits and we'll redistribute it mainly to children. And that's really the story of the 2000s, is how we tackled poverty. And that had some effect. Not a huge amount, but it had some effect. The other strategy, which became predominant in this decade, or sorry, the last decade, I'm still living in 2019, sorry. In the last decade was to fix the poor. The idea was that the poor, they weren't working in this economy. We had to fix them, and that fixing the poor came in sort of happy, sort of kinder ways, providing training, providing support. But that quickly morphs into the much cheaper and much harsher providing incentives and providing punishments. And by incentive, I mean, when government says we are creating work incentives, what they mean is the difference between being on benefits and being in work is increasing. And you can do that in two ways. You can either do it by increasing wages, which wasn't done a lot, or you can do it by cutting benefits, which was done a lot. So that you increase incentives essentially by cutting benefits. And during after 2010, you get these huge benefit cuts. And actually, I would love to talk for a long time on what happened and that, but I won't. But the thing that sort of crosses a moral boundary for me is priority changes, where the benefit system explicitly moved from trying to help families make ends meet. It explicitly moves to saying, I want to change your behavior. And 2 weeks ago, we got the first food security numbers for the United Kingdom, and 4 out of 10 universal credit claimants are food insecure. That means they miss a meal a week, at least. That means they're worried about tomorrow's food. And if you are using the hunger of families and children to shape their behavior, you've crossed a moral line as far as I'm concerned. But those two strategies haven't really worked. And we see that poverty is increasing despite them both being used. And that's because both assume that the way in which we operate and grow the economy needs to be unchanged. That actually we could solve poverty by doing something to the poor rather than doing something that affects all of us. And I want to go back to what Jesus said at the start, which is when talking about poverty, he immediately went back to what are the rules you're running your society by? What are the rules that affect all of us? Because Jubilee affected everyone. It wasn't just something done to the poor. It affected rich and poor alike. And if you want to solve poverty, you have to affect everyone. And these are both attempts of differing types to solve poverty by only affecting the poor. And yeah. And so, but my criticism about preferencing those who own things is more than just the money didn't trickle down. If you think, if your philosophy is that we must give power to those who own things, and we must take the interests of those who own things and the views of those who own things, because they best know how to create wealth, then you systematically make yourself blind and deaf to other voices and other stories. And that change in inequality that you see isn't just about one economic policy. It's about the fact that voices were systematically ignored the whole way through. That yes, you're the cleaner in this factory and you've been outsourced and you've got nothing and your wages are down. But actually, that's just the way the world works. That's how modern economies work. Why don't you go off and train to do something else? Was what they heard, as opposed to being listened to about how they had pride in cleaning. I mean, my daughter's just come out of hospital, and the difference between the two hospitals we've been in, where one doesn't have outsourced cleaning anymore. Now, that's probably why I'm focusing on outsourced cleaners at the moment, but one that doesn't have outsourced cleaning, and the pride that the person who came round at the end of the day had in this place being good and that it didn't have many infections over the people who were outsourced and didn't, and were, you know, had a rapid turnover of staff. That story wasn't heard because the economy was in the interests of other people. And there's all sorts of stories we've chosen not to hear. And the other idea, the other criticism is that the common good was defined as more wealth and more GDP. As long as we had more wealth and more GDP, we could sort out the rest later. But actually, the common good is about the process of creating wealth and the process of having a national economy. And everybody needs to be involved in the conversations about how that process happens, both those who own things and those who work on things and those who can't work on things, those who are retired and those are too ill to be able to work. And it's a much more complicated and difficult process, but actually it's a much more rich process when you do it. Just saying more money, more GDP is the wrong way forward. So I was going to show you this video, but I'm a little bit over, so I'm not going to. But this project called COVID Realities, if you go to its website, there's a number of videos on them, including some stories from Northern Ireland of people telling their stories about how the economy treated them during the pandemic. And I'll just finish with one story about which I think is hopeful. Because there's a place called, started off as Glasgow Poverty Truth Commission, and then it becomes Scotland's Poverty Truth Commission over time. And it's where people who experience poverty come together and they share stories amongst themselves. And it's a 3-year process. And in the first phase is that the people who experience poverty are built up and they tell stories to each other and they understand that their story has value, because often they're told it doesn't. And then they meet people who make decisions in their society. So the first round of the Truth Commission had the former Deputy First Minister and had many other people from job centres and from other places around who made decisions that affect those in poverty. And then they just met. They didn't come together to make solutions. They came together to have a relationship and to share their stories and to share their experiences of the world. And only on year 3 did they start thinking about what can we do about it, only when they understood each other. And Poverty Truth Commissions have done brilliant things, really small stuff around how do you word a tax demand, a council tax demand, such that somebody's not so frightened that they just leave it in the drawer. Really big things about how do we ensure that people who experience poverty get a voice in the committees that make decisions about budgeting. And to this day, somebody from Scotland's Poverty Truth Commission meets with his senior civil servants in Scotland, and they meet to have a cup of tea. So that senior civil servant at least knows that when they make a decision about someone who experiences poverty, that they will have to talk to somebody who's affected by that decision and have a cup of tea with them and justify themselves in the same way as they would to somebody who lives in their social group. So change can happen if we tell the right stories. And I think I'll stop there.
Paul, thank you very much. You've raised a lot of issues. You've given us a lot of data, and there are a lot of challenges there. You began, I suppose, by reminding us that poverty is caused by structures, that when we talk about poverty in the UK, it needs to be poverty today. Presumably, we need to apply the same to the rest of Ireland as well. And we had that fascinating insight into a Poverty Truth Commission in Scotland that seems to be doing amazing things and perhaps needs to be taken seriously on this side of the Irish Sea as well. Wealth inequality, income inequality, food insecurity for more and more people now. The common good is a process of creating wealth. Those are some of the things I think you've left us with. Now we go to rooms, we go to small group discussion. We are a pluralist participative democracy, hopefully. So we hope that within every group, those who want to speak will have the opportunity to speak. It might be helpful if there was one person in each group who might try to just facilitate the discussion and ensure that a reasonable discussion takes place. Maybe what struck you most about Paul's presentation? And then if in your group you can identify one further question that you would like to ask or like clarification on, and we can bring that back to our plenary discussion. We take 20 minutes in our groups. Ian,